Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's kick off this interview as we always do, just by having you introduce yourself briefly and tell us who you are and what you do.
Sure. So, yeah, my name's Simon J. Woolf. I'm a writer, author of two books about different kinds of wine, one of which we're going to talk about. I'm originally British, but I'm based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands.
How did you come to be based in Amsterdam, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, everybody always asks that. It's because wine wasn't always my main career. So back in the day, I actually had a career in IT, and I landed a good job here. Amsterdam is kind of the IT capital of Europe at the moment, pretty much. So that was the initial trigger to move here. But I got comfortable here, like we often do, and yeah, I'm still here after 8 years.
Yeah. So the wine culture here in the US is obviously centered sort of around Napa Valley. In Europe, there are, the obvious hotspots on the mainland. How did you work your way into wine as someone who started off living in the UK and then made your way to Amsterdam, which is, I mean, obviously has access to many of those mainland hotspots, but is not geographically right next to one of them. How did you kind of work your way into the wine space?
Yeah, I guess wine always had a fascination for me. And I can remember, I think it was the late 90s, the early 2000s, my then girlfriend, I think she kind of despaired at me, really, because she could see that I was so interested in it. And so she packed me off to a course about wine. It was just a course at a local wine shop. And I studied there for a few evenings, really enjoyed it. And then I thought, you know what? This isn't enough. I want to go deeper. So I just kind of got really into it just as a hobby. And then a few years later, I rather randomly started a wine blog back in the day when that kind of thing was still cool. We're talking 2011 now. And I was kind of shocked that I had actual readers. I had people that were actually deriving value from my rather amateur efforts. So I thought, you know what, this has got legs. And that's really when I started to get the opportunity to travel more widely. So my appreciation of wine really deepened, I think. And yeah, it just went from there, really. So then gradually it became a part-time gig. I accepted, okay, this is a side career. And then from being a side career, whoops, became my main career.
Well, that sounds like quite a happy accident. Um, Being in the IT space, it doesn't surprise me that the blog was the initiating impulse that kind of got you rolling here. Um, since you kind of took us through this story, I'm wondering if there were any flavor experiences, any particular bottles, any of those early trips to visit some of these growing regions that really captivated you. Do you any of those memories that really became a well to which you would often return for inspiration?
Well, of course, there was one, and we're going to talk about it because there was the fabled moment in 2011 when I was in northern Italy for a wine bloggers conference, which I couldn't believe my luck that such a thing existed. So I was bunking off my day job and having fun tasting wine. And then after the conference, they took us on a trip to the very far northeast of Italy to a region called Friuli. And I ended up in the cellar of a man named Sandy Skerk, who's a winemaker in Friuli Caso, in a tiny little village called Propoto. And he handed me a glass of something, and my mind was officially blown. And of course, what he handed me was an orange wine. I didn't even know what to call it back then. I just knew, well, this is something of the like I've never tasted before. It's a strange color. It's got a strange aroma. It's got a strange flavor. I didn't know if I loved it or hated it. I just knew I had to know more about it.
Yes, those experiences where in the cocktail world, there's a number of them. Very often, someone's first Negroni is one of those quasi aversive experiences.
Favorite of
Um,
mine, by the way.
of course, I mean, so many, so many great ingredients in there. Obviously, the vermouth is a wine base, and the Campari with so many of those wonderful botanicals, that beautiful bitterness. Chartreuse happens to be another one of those flavors and experiences that people never forget. I always describe my first experience tasting chartreuse as like seeing a color that you never knew existed. So it doesn't surprise me that for you, orange wine was that experience, and certainly amplified by the fact that you were being guided through it by the producer. That's also an incredibly powerful experience that I think, having spent the last 2 years either afraid to or prohibited from visiting places and having these in-person interactions in the beverage space, we tend to forget the sheer power of being guided through a flavor experience by the person who is intimately acquainted with that, and very often who is responsible for those flavors existing in large part. So it doesn't surprise me that that maker's experience in the cellar of the maker was the initiating incident that kicked off your fascination with orange wines, which of course has eventually resulted in your book that we're here to talk about today. So can you just give us an overview of your book, and we will get to your second book. Yes, holding up for those of you who are going to be tuning into the video, we've got the book Amber Revolution, and you've got the wonderful cover art. You staged your shot perfectly, Simon.
Had to do it.
So yeah, tell us about Amber Revolution, and then we'll kind of back our way into the what orange wine is and some of the history and culture
Sure.
as we go.
So basically, it did pretty much start with this trip in 2011, where I was tasting wines that were just, I felt they were unique. I didn't have a vocabulary to describe them, but I think more importantly, I could see, it wasn't just one winemaker. After the first cellar, we went to another cellar and then another, and I thought, all these guys are doing this. What's going on? This is a thing. This is culture. This is a tradition, and I wanted to know more. So when I got back from that trip, I did what any self-respecting writer would do, and I started researching. I thought there must be a book about this. So I looked up Friuli. Nothing, almost nothing. I looked up orange wine or macerated white wine, and I just couldn't find enough information to go as deep as I wanted to go. I found a few solitary articles. Luckily enough, Eric Asimov, the wine journalist for the New York Times, had written a couple of excellent pieces, but it was pretty Spartan. So I kept on digging away at it, and I kept on discovering. I discovered that the Republic of Georgia was a key part of this style of wine as well. So I had all these pieces of a puzzle, but I just didn't know how they fitted together, and it was quite frustrating. And I think it took me 3 or 4 years before I realized, well, if this book that I really want to read, if these questions that I really want answered about where this style of wine comes from and what's behind it in terms of culture and history, if it doesn't exist, maybe it's going to have to be me that writes it.
Yes, there's often that moment. I have experienced that moment with some podcast episodes where it's very often a subject that's much smaller than something like orange wine, which is a multinational, somewhat global phenomenon. But I'm familiar with the impulse of like, well, I'm not satisfied with what's out there, so it looks like it's time to dig in. So, what to you did that process of digging in entail? How did you begin to put some of those puzzle pieces, as you mentioned, together?
Basically, it involves travel. It involved traveling to the key wine regions. So it involved numerous trips back to Friuli. I'd managed to identify kind of who the main protagonists were, but of course, more winemakers, more protagonists came out of the woodwork as I deepened my research. So it was really about just going and knocking on doors and talking to people. And really actually getting quite close to some of the families who brought this ancient style of wine kind of back on top of mind, really. So, I mean, there are two families in particular, the Radikon family and the Gravner family, both in a small village of Oslavia, which is basically ethnically Slovene, but still in modern day Italy. You know, I really had to get to know those guys very well and find out what had driven them to bring this style of wine back into being, really, from a kind of obscure footnote in history. And of course, Georgia was another key part as well. I knew I had to get to Georgia and ended up going there a few times. So yeah, it was just lots of talking and listening and traveling and collating, and then trying to figure out how do I make this into a story that people will want to read.
Yeah. I have a feeling that as we go deeper here, some of the larger plot points in that story will become clear. I have a number of follow ups I'd like to ask on that. But before I do, before I completely derail this and just start chasing down my little areas and points of fascination, I would love for you to provide our listeners with a working definition of orange wine, because I'm guessing it's not made from oranges. I would also love if you could go one step further than that, by which I mean, like, okay, you're going to give us the basic definition, but are there certain production methods or grapes that are typically used for this? Give us the high level definition and then maybe work us a little bit deeper, because our listeners certainly are familiar with wine and probably, some more familiar than a lay audience would be, if that helps.
Great. Yeah. Well, I think I'll give a very simple technical definition, and then maybe I'll just put that into historical context because that's an
Yeah.
important part of this, really. So the technical definition, and this is as simple as I can make it, is that you take white grapes and then you ferment them with their skins, and that's the key difference because most modern white wine is fermented without the skins. And if you think about it, that's why it is usually so pale in color, because most of the pigmentation, some of those flavors and aromas that you wouldn't expect in a white wine, all of that sits in the skins. So modern white wine production, you get rid of the skins after a few hours, really, and then you go ferment the juice, the pulp. Orange wine, you leave the skins in there. So you're getting this long maceration. You're extracting structure, you're extracting tannins from the skins, you're extracting all those aromas and flavors that you otherwise wouldn't be getting. And that's why you end up with a wine that is usually a much darker hue, and it can span a huge range. Sometimes it really has an orange tint, sometimes it can be dark amber colored. And often these are wines that, in terms of texture, sit closer to red wines because they're getting that pickup of the phenolic compounds, the tannins, if you like, that are in the skins. So that's
Mm.
the technical definition. Culturally, what's interesting and what I gradually discovered is that this is pretty much the oldest way of making wine that we know about. And of course, it dates back to a time when, in many parts of the world, people would not have worried about separating white grape varieties from red. They just had a whole bunch of stuff in the vineyard. Whatever they had, it all got thrown in together, and out came wine. But in the parts of the world where maybe white grape varieties were in the ascendant, they were more important. Um, if you didn't have technology, you only have to go back a few hundred years. People didn't have wine presses. They didn't have stainless steel tanks. They didn't have ways of keeping all this stuff cool. So you just had to basically crush the grapes up as best you could with your feet or with a wooden pole, and then off you go, and it starts fermenting. So this is why it's so interesting when we start to look at somewhere like Georgia, because in Georgia, there is archaeological evidence of this style of wine being made in amphoras, in clay pots, um, perhaps as long ago as 8,000 years. So, really, we can say that orange wine is how wine was. It's just that somewhere along the line, basically in our industrial age, we got attached to this idea of this pale colored, squeaky clean beverage that we call white wine.
Hmm.
And then everybody thought, okay, these other wines that are a darker hued, maybe a bit cloudy, they're primitive. That's not what we should be selling. That's not what people want, really. And so that's how it was for a long time.
Hmm. As a tech guy, I'm sure that you are familiar with the very often hazy distinction between a bug and a feature. It seems like that is a little bit at the heart of what you're referring to there. Now, uh, you mentioned the word amphore, which is, many people who've ever visited a museum that deals with, Roman or Greek time periods, in the in Mediterranean classical or antiquated history, have seen these, kind of tallish, curvy vessels that are often used to store wine. Are there other names for these vessels, perhaps in the Georgian tradition, or am I maybe thinking of another term in the orange wine world here?
No, you're absolutely right to pick me up on that. And to be honest, I'll get into deep trouble if any Georgian winemaker hears what I just said. So I use the term amphora because that's a kind of catch-all term that people tend to hone in on for clay pots. But of course, the Georgian term for their very specific type of clay pot is the Qvevery. And the Qvevery is a large type of clay pot. It can hold maybe 1,000, 2,000 liters in some cases. It has a pointed bottom and it's buried in the ground as well. So they're not freestanding. And then you have all the other variants. People in Spain had something similar, but it's called a tinaja. In Portugal, in the south, there's a Roman tradition, and they're called talhas. So there's many different names, and they're all slightly different vessels, they're slightly different shapes, slightly different traditional methods of pottery and firing, and some are freestanding, some aren't. So yes, there are many variants, but I mean, again, you go back 1,000 years or so, and not everybody had access to wooden barrels. There was no such thing as stainless steel.
Sure, sure. And the reason why I wanted to have you speak a little bit more on that is because, obviously you started us off, possibly as far back in time as 8,000 years ago. You also mentioned that probably in the early days of wine production in these, uh, maybe we'll call them these vinous societies, sort of evolving their own cultures. You mentioned that red and white grapes may have been, in the same vessel. You take what's in the vineyard, that's sugar, that's energy, that's fermentable substrate. So we're going to use that. Um, and then over time, we have some of these branching distinctions, right? We have the Qveries in the Georgian tradition and some of these other styles that you mentioned. And it might be easy to say, like, well, it's just kind of the jug that they put it in, right? Recently, I had an interesting experience in the culinary realm. I started trying to learn how to make a really nice cassoulet, which is the
Lovely.
southern French sort of. You might call it a casserole, but it's made with tarbay white beans and lots of rich pork and duck products. And one of the interesting things that I uncovered in my research is that it's called a cassoulet because down in Gascony, where this dish was originally created, they make it in a clay pot called a cassoule, and the cassoule is not the same shape as most of the cooking vessels that we would use in today's kitchen, a Dutch oven perhaps, or some other type of casserole pan. It had a much larger sort of surface area. And the thing that most people in the cassoulet tradition try to achieve is this really hard crust at the top. And in doing this research, I realized that it just wasn't going to happen the same way for me because I didn't have something that had that kind of pointed conical bottom, almost like you were mentioning in the Qveries. And so I had to find a way to engineer that hard crust on the top by some other method because it just was not destined for me based on the tool that I was using. And the reason why I make that point is not to say anything about Cassoulet, but just to point out that some of these incidental differences in culture and style that evolve over time end up having a massive impact on the end flavor of a product. So is I want to use this as a way to kind of branch out into the different kind of regions of orange wine. We mentioned Georgia. We mentioned that there was a perhaps a Slovenian strain kind of moving into Italy. Um, can you identify some of the key important orange wine producing regions and maybe talk about as we go some of these differences and some of the things that they try to play up flavor wise in their expressions?
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, in a way, I can simplify it. I think. I mean, there are traditions of clay and there are traditions of wood. And obviously, the Georgian tradition is very much this tradition of clay. I think it's partly because there's at least one part of Georgia, the region of Imereti, which has this absolutely fantastic raw material. It's supposed to be the best clay in the country, if not in the world. So I think it's probably natural that people realize they had this great material that they could make vessels out of. And indeed, the Georgian tradition is all based around that vessel. And the Qvevri, it takes on an almost mythical dimension, really. Any Georgian winemaker will talk about it as a womb for the wine. And the Georgians have this wonderful phrase where they say, wine is not made, it's born. And in fact, if you in Georgian language, if you talk about making wine, it has a negative connotation, because there's really this idea that you don't make wine. You put the grapes in the Qvevri, and then the magic happens, and you just let it be until it's ready. So this is very connected with the vessel. Georgians use Qvevris for all kinds of other things too. Some people are even buried in them. Uh, so they have a real significance in the culture as well as affecting the winemaking. And we can talk about maybe how they affect the winemaking technically if you want.
Yes,
But
please.
okay, wasn't sure how deep you wanted me to go, but I mean the thing with ovoid vessels, ovoid shaped vessels for fermentation, is that you get different kind of heat transfer, you get a different kind of extraction going on. You get basically when fermentation is happening, as I'm sure you know, you get a buildup of heat and CO2. And ovoid egg-shaped containers seem to induce convection currents, that do a kind of gentle massaging of whatever you have in there. So you get extraction, but it's of a different sort than you would get if you were doing it in a simple conical shaped vessel. And I think that's why in Georgian culture, the Georgian amber wines, orange wines, whatever you want to call them, traditionally they would just let it sit there for 6 months or sometimes even longer, and it wouldn't over extract, because of the shape of the Qvevri. Whereas you compare that with particularly the Central and Eastern European tradition, and I'll include Slovenia and the north of Italy very much in that, probably Croatia and a few other parts of the Balkans too. There, obviously, you've traditionally had massive forests all over the place, especially in the Croatian region of Slavonia. So it's the perfect place to make barrels, and that's what people always did. So there, the tradition has always been much more about barrels, usually rather large barrels. Again, sort of what the Italians would call botti grande, so 1,000 liters or maybe even bigger. And there you get more extraction. Also, of course, you have different grape varieties and different ways of making the wine. So I think that the style of the wine is very different. I think particularly in Western Slovenia, for example, you tend to get these more kind of massive structured orange wines than you might somewhere a little bit further west, say in Austria, somewhere like that. So yes, of course, it does have an effect, and it's fascinating to see how all these cultural touch points do affect the tradition, and affect what people feel is authentic or not in any given region.
As you were just describing all of those cultural differences, and you almost might refer to them as cultural terroirs because the clay, the wood, those are parts of the land. Those are parts of the indigenous geography where the people were growing these grapes. So it makes sense. It is kind of the tradition of what grows together goes together, right? And grapes grow near where there's clay, they go in the clay. Grapes grow where there's woods, they go in the wood
Exactly.
barrels. This is um, makes sense to me. But what really clicked for me as you were describing that, and I was trying to create a map of these regions and follow you through this map in my mind, was you're right. I haven't really been thinking about the fact that there are so many different white grape varietals involved here. Of course, we're talking about these different vessels where they're fermented and then aged. We're talking about different cultures, obviously, but the grape varieties is something that just clicked to me, and suddenly I was imagining myself tasting a really delicate Pinot Noir from some a region in Burgundy, and comparing that to some big boned Pinotage from South Africa, or some really peppery Malbec from Argentina or something like that, and having these three red wine experiences be so vastly different, that doesn't strike me as strange. But all of a sudden, we turn the conversation to white grapes, and it seems very foreign to me. And I had almost like this sense of anxiety, like the landscape all of a sudden kind of dropped out from under me. How, when you were researching Amber Revolution, did you try to understand the impact that the grape varietals had on the orange wine?
Well, it kind of it grabbed me by the throat and led me to the story actually, because one of the first places that I really went deep into for my research was Friuli Collio, this very far northeastern bit touching Slovenia, and in fact it's a cross border region really. It's called Collio, which means hills in Italian. It's called Brda, which means hills in Slovene. It's one region. It's just that unfortunately, after two world wars, there's a nation border in the way. But in that region, there's a grape variety with at least 1,200 years of history, called in Italian Ribolla Gialla and in Slovene Ribolla. And this variety is very interesting. Clearly, it's well suited to the area. It's well suited to the climate, and this is ultimately where you find particular grape varieties in particular places. It's because they tolerate the climate. They've survived basically over many centuries or even millennia. But the thing about Ribolla Gialla is that it has incredibly thick skins. It's a white grape variety, but with super thick skins. And one of the problems that the winemakers in those regions started telling me is that the reason their grandfathers or their grandparents used to often end up doing skin contact using the skins for these wines was because you couldn't actually press those grapes. If you had an old-fashioned screw press, it would jam the press because the skins were so thick. So often people would end up just leaving the grapes sat there for a week until they'd softened enough that they could actually press them. And of course, after a week, you're going to have fermentation. So in a way, looking at this very particular grape variety and its sort of slightly unique properties solved the key to me of why orange wine was always a thing in those regions. It started to make sense. So that was a key part of the puzzle, I think. And I think similarly in Georgia as well. I mean, in Georgia there are grape varieties that you really don't find anywhere else, and they are just so beautiful when you use the skins. And I'm talking about maybe the classic varieties for Georgia, like Katsiteli or Tsvane or Kisi. They're good enough varieties if you make them into a Western style white wine, but they're far more exciting when you use the skins. So it makes perfect sense, really, that people would do that. I think just one other thing to add as well, which I forgot. I always like to hate on Ribolla Gialla a little bit because it's a terrifically dull grape if you don't use the skins. The flesh and the juice really doesn't have a strong character. You talk about varieties like Sauvignon Blanc or Muscat. They have very readily identifiable fruit profiles. They have a character that people can latch onto. Ribolla doesn't have any of that in its juice. It's rather neutral. It just has acidity, and that's about it really. But you use the skins, and it's a different matter. That's where all the flavor of that grape variety is, and then it becomes majestic, it becomes regal, it becomes complex, honeyed. So to me, it's not using the skins, not making an orange wine out of Ribolla. It's like Sasha Radikon once said to me, it's like you would take the Merlot from Chateau Petrus in Pomerol and just make a simple rosé from it. What's the
That's a
point?
yeah. That's excellent. I'm glad that you came in with that metaphor, because I was struggling. I was trying to identify like something in the culinary space where I could kind of draw a parallel, but that's fascinating. Do you find that in general? Now, I imagine, as in anything, there are plenty of exceptions to any rule, but in general, do you find that most orange wine is made using white grapes that tend to have those thicker skins?
Not necessarily. No, I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
think especially now that the category has broadened so much, um, maybe that's true in history. Yeah, maybe we can say that. But certainly, I mean, it has a great deal of worth even with thinner skins.
Hmm.
I think that's the thing. There is such a multiplicity of styles in the orange wine category, uh, with so many grape varieties. I mean, for example, sure, grapes with thick skins give you something complex, something structured, something with a lot of texture. But there's more magic that this technique of making wine can achieve as well. And I also learned fairly early on that aromatic grape varieties, so like Gewürztraminer or all the different types of muscat, are absolutely fantastic when they're fermented with their skins, because you get a kind of concentration of those aromatics, but you get a balancing effect by the fact that suddenly there's texture and there's structure, where you can have we've probably all had that experience of a flabby Gewürztraminer that just smells like grandma's attic, and it's too much. It's too floral, it's over the top, and there's nothing to offset it. But when you have more texture, then it's a different matter. So I think aromatic varieties can also perform very well. I think the only thing really that I think is key is having some freshness, some acidity, because often these wines are a little bit more complex, a little bit more full-bodied than maybe some simpler white wine styles. So if you start to lose freshness, then they can be a bit heavy, they can be a bit wearing, I would say.
Mm. Well, I'm glad that you brought up acidity, and it's also interesting that you mentioned the muscat and the Gewürztraminer, because where my mind immediately goes after those two would be sort of rounding that trio out with a Riesling, sort of
Yeah.
another
Mhm.
highly aromatic, but a grape variety where the makers have traditionally, in the 3M rivers region of the Marne, Meuse, and Moselle, have had a great deal of leeway to play with different levels of residual sugar. So, since we're speaking about acid, sugar, flabbiness, intensity, um, do you find the same sort of range of sweetnesses and acidities in orange wine that you might find in, for example, the Riesling category, where you can go from very dry and almost bracing to something that is a full-on Trockenbeeren Auslese dessert wine?
Usually not, and there's a good reason for that. So when we talk about orange wine, because we're talking about, if you like, an ancestral style, a traditional style, most of the winemakers who are willed to make it want to make it in a hands-off traditional way. So they don't control the fermentation; they let it do whatever it wants. And when you include skins, which you do to make an orange wine, there's a much better chance that you will ferment every last bit of sugar away. White grapes without skins to make a white wine. This is occasionally where winemakers might run into trouble and get a stuck fermentation and end up with some residual sugar in the wine. And that's also when people might decide to step in and intervene with technology or additions. But with orange wine, because the skins are there providing a lot more yeast cultures, typically you'll get a more reliable ferment, and you will get all the way to dryness pretty much every time. So orange wine, I'd say 99.99% of the time means dry wine.
Mm. And I imagine in this respect, the structure, the dryness, as you mentioned, the benevolent addition in most cases of a little bit of acidity to bring it to life would make orange wine incredibly food friendly. Would that be accurate?
I think it'd be very accurate, yeah, and I think that's certainly one of the things that I absolutely adore about these wines, because to me, you've got all bases covered. You've got some of the textures and structures that we all love in red wine. You know, some tannins to kind of clean the mouth if you've got a fatty piece of meat or dairy or what. I'm trying to think of a vegan alternative, but sorry, vegans. But but simultaneously, you've got this feeling of freshness and acidity that we tend to associate more classically with white wine. So to me, you've got the best points of both styles in one package. And I've heard so many sommeliers say, this is the get out of jail free card. When you've got the table with an irreconcilable combination of dishes, this is what you can do. I've also found, interestingly, that foods that traditionally are a nightmare to pair with wine, such as very spicy cuisine, some Asian cuisines, very piquant, very, very strong flavors that don't always combine with classic wine styles. Again, you take something like a skin fermented muscat, a muscat made as a dry orange wine, and it just works without needing to think.
I bet that I love that get out of jail free metaphor. Um, I have a feeling that we may not, but I'm hoping we'll have time to get back to, um, some of you mentioned some technological interventions a moment ago. You mentioned the sort of get out of jail free card. Now that orange wine has caught on, I have a feeling that there are a few things being done in the space that may not be precisely in the spirit of what these original kind of traditional makers who are very non-interventionist might be comfortable with. So we may have time to return to that. But what I'd like to do instead right now is to pose to you a bit of a thought experiment and see what you think about it, because orange wine is very much in vogue right now. Obviously, the pandemic had a bit of an interruption. Here in the US, we don't have a very strong orange wine tradition. We have some domestic makers who are playing around with it, but generally we're importing these orange wines, and COVID has not been friendly to us in that respect. So I've definitely seen less buzz around orange wine here in the US than perhaps there was right before the pandemic kicked off in earnest. There was a lot of talk about skin contact and all this stuff, and it has definitely, kind of been reduced to a simmer from what was sort of a frantic boil beforehand. But assuming that we will have the opportunity to kind of finally return to what we were obsessed with right before things got weird, let's imagine that one of our listeners wanted to pick up a bottle of orange wine, and they walked into a wine shop or a liquor store that had an entire shelf dedicated to orange wine. Certainly, probably something that you're not going to encounter, but this is a thought experiment. So let's imagine there's a whole wall dedicated to orange wine, just like there is dedicated to red wines and white wines in most traditional wine shops. If that was the case in this imaginary scenario, how would you think that that would be organized? And what would this person who's walking up to this wall of orange wines and trying to walk away with the one bottle that is going to be excellent for the meal preparation that they're trying to do, for example, how would they go about locating the bottle that's right for them in this giant selection?
I mean, in a way, I would say that it's no different to any other wine style. And by the way, I do know wine shops and restaurants where this is not only something in your imagination. There are enough places now that take orange wines seriously enough as a category that you can have that choice. And I think where the wine shop has done their curation properly, they'll have those wines organized, and they'll maybe start by saying, okay, these are the lighter orange wines, maybe fresher, maybe less structure, less tannins. These are the heavier ones. So you can immediately hone in on that. You can say, do I want a light wine or a heavier, more complex wine for whatever I'm going to be pairing it with tonight. I think then, of course, you can go by things like country and grape variety. These usually provide helpful clues, and I think it's just like your analogy about Pinot Noir, lighter Pinot Noirs or heavier Pinotages. You can apply that logic to orange wine as well if you either if you've got a bit of experience with them, or if the assistant in the shop knows what they're talking about. And it's, to me, that's no different than anything else. If you like wine, you probably know that a Napa Cab or a Bordeaux red wine is going to give you something heavier, maybe a bit more intellectual, whereas a Cabernet Franc from the Loire or maybe a Pinot Noir from Burgundy might give you something that feels a little bit lighter, more playful, more ethereal. These aren't givens, but they're certainly guidelines. And orange wine to me is no different. Once you get to know so the stylistics, okay, Georgian wines from the east of Georgia, from Kakheti, are traditionally big, bold, and structured, and you need to like tannins. Slovenia also, the Western Slovenia, the wines tend to be a little bit more full-bodied, riper, heavier. But if you go somewhere like Austria, Burgenland, there's a really interesting tradition developing for very fruit forward orange styles, very kind of charming, very youthful, and often very fresh tasting. So I think these are things that people can hone in on. You can hone in on a favorite grape variety. Sauvignon Blanc is amazing with skin contact, and there are a ton of them being made now in Styria in Austria, for example, or a few other places. And I think, beyond that, there are all the other things that you either know, or you ask, or you look at the bottle. I mean, I personally, if I don't know a wine, the clues that I look at is, what's the alcohol percentage? Is this going to be a ripe wine? Is it a 14.5% slammer, or is it a 11.5% something I can neck half the bottle without feeling guilty? So I'd look at that. I would try to find out if it's been aged in oak or not, or or maybe amphora. So all of these would give some clue maybe to the style. But at the end of the day, there's no replacement for experimentation. So some things you just got to take a chance, take a recommendation, or pick something randomly and see what happens. Really,
right.
serendipity.
Well, there's serendipity, and there's also the case to be made for making friends with the folks who are working at your local wine shop.
Absolutely. And of course, restaurants with good sommeliers is another perfect environment. You might be lucky to score a glass of something and without having to commit to a bottle. So that's also a great place for discovery.
Sure. As you have taken us through some of the history, culture, and geography of orange wine, one of the best spirits parallels that I think I can draw is the agave space, in that there are so many different varietals that can be used for these, artisan mezcals and raicillas and sotols and all these different varieties of agave experience that we have. They're so very often produced using non-interventionist fermentation practices. There's a lot of local terroir and culture that go into it. The shapes of the stills are very different, in kind of the same way that the shapes of these fermenters are a little bit different and can vary from place to place and culture to culture. So I see a lot of parallels between the orange wine world and the artisanal agave world. Obviously, some of the big brands have gone in and industrialized a lot of these over the last decade or so. But in the artisan world of craft agave, very many parallels that I'm able to draw. So if anybody listening is more of a spirits drinker who's trying to develop a wine hobby, you might think about, in the metaphor that we just gave of this entire shelf of orange wines, You might think of that almost as if you had access to all of these different artisan agave makers. Some of the same principles apply, but it does seem to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, it seems like the hand of the maker is ultimately going to be one of the things that has the greatest impact here. Is that accurate?
I think the hand of the maker is may still be the biggest part, yes, but I would say that the tradition in a particular place still carries a lot of weight too, and certainly, I mean, particularly thinking about Slovenia and Georgia, and there are many other countries, actually many regions of Italy as well. That there is still a sometimes quite a surprising adherence to tradition, and
Mm,
the winemaker has the tools, has the power to take it in a different direction. But often there is this thing, we get into rather nebulous words like typicity or tradition or integrity. But these things do count for something, and I think they leave their mark on the wine as well.
for sure. And that also is a big thing in the spirit space here in the U.S., especially the category of American single malts, which is an emerging category. Um, we don't have the peat that they do in Scotland. We don't
Right.
have the
Mm.
barley that they have there, and yet we're trying to do something similar. And the question is, do we want to kind of create a completely different category that is as different from a Scottish single malt as the Argentinian Malbec is from, something that was, grown on the continent in Europe? Or do we want to kind of try and convert some of these single malt drinkers with something that might be a little familiar to them? Which kind of may speak to some of the trends that I'd like to kind of wrap up the main portion of the interview here. But before we do, I want to speak about your book, Amber Revolution, as a tool for people who want to learn more about orange wine. You've given us a lot of great basics, but my hope is that having heard our conversation thus far, people might be interested in learning about all of those characters, right? The protagonists, you called them earlier. So if some of our listeners were to pick up Amber Revolution, how would you recommend using that as a tool to get a little bit more into orange wine? Or are there any any tips and tricks for using that as a guide to kind of fuel your new orange wine obsession?
Absolutely. So the book is very much divided into two parts. The most important part is a story, really. And when I set out to write this book, I powerfully did not want to write a dry textbook. I my goal that I had in my mind is I wanted to write a book that you want to take to bed and read and cuddle up with, basically. So I wrote it much more like a novel. So the main part of the book that takes us through my experience first, and then Italy and Slovenia, and then Georgia, hones in on a few main characters and goes quite deep into their personal histories. So the idea is that it's a fun read. It's a fairly easy read. It's not bogged down with technical detail. I just want to get you excited, really, about this, and I want to get you excited in the same way that I was excited when I could feel this weight of history and culture on these wines. And so the idea is to communicate that. The second part of the book, which is much smaller, is a kind of gazetteer of producers around the world that you can dip into. So that's the kind of the reference part, if you like. And in the first edition, that was 180 winemakers in 20 odd countries. In the second edition, which it is now,
Very
it
nice.
is shot up to 230 odd producers, and I ended up adding countries like Japan and Greece and the UK. So I think there are 32 countries now represented. So almost anywhere you are in the world, you can open the book and you can probably find some references for wines that are reasonably readily available, and maybe even wineries where you can jump in the car and go and visit them.
What really appeals to me about the structure of Amber Revolution is that it very much is, in that sense, a travelogue, right? You go through the first part of the book, which is a travelogue, kind of authored by you and your lived experiences. And then you've got the kind of resource in the back, which allows you to plan future travel, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whether that travel is via a bottle that you pick up at the liquor store and transports your palate to a different place, or whether you want to physically go and visit some of these places. So I love that. For anybody who has read By the Smoke and the Smell by Thad Vogler, which is a much more sort of kind of scattered memoirs of visiting different places and different spirits, this kind of strikes me as a more focused kind of singular product, but going through many different regions. So those two, your book and By the Smoke and the Smell seem to share a little common strand of DNA in that respect.
Nice.
So going to trends really quickly, are there any trends that you see emerging, especially considering the historical context that we're living in right now with the pandemic? As we're emerging from this, are there any trends that people might want to keep their eyes open for in the world of orange wine?
I think the only trend is that it's just widening and broadening all the time. It's extraordinary, actually. I mean, I I didn't witness this moment because 20 years ago I didn't know what orange wine was and I'd never tasted one. But 20 years ago, the pioneers that brought this winemaking idea back into a bottle, and I'm talking about people like Josko Gravner and Stanko Radikon in Italy, um, they were absolutely panned for what they were doing. They had wines sent back to them. They were told that they were madmen. They didn't know what they were doing. It absolutely was not accepted by the winerati, if we can call it that. Whereas 10 years later, they managed to get the things moving. They managed to convince their customers, and they managed to convince people around the world that this is a style worth taking seriously. This is something that you can consider as fine wine. Now, here we are, 20, 25, 30 years later. I think almost every winemaker in the world knows that this is an option. It's like winemakers just got another paintbrush to paint with, another color on the color palette, really. And winemakers love to play, and I think that's why we've gradually seen this idea sort of trickle down into every wine region, every winemaking country in the world. So you have places like Australia and New Zealand that they don't have the weight of tradition on their shoulders like we do here in Europe. A little bit the same in the US. So it's a playground. And what's interesting about that is that we haven't just seen a profusion of orange wine and of acceptance of the technique and that it can make something tasty and fun. We've also seen some very smart winemakers realize that it's not all or nothing. You can do blends. You can part skin ferment. You can have a half orange wine, half white wine. It doesn't have to be one thing or the other. So we're now seeing all kinds of hybrids. We're seeing people looking at it just as another tool in the toolbox that you can use when it makes sense and play with all you want.
Yeah, I love how flexible orange wine can be in that respect, right? You have the people who follow the deep traditions, and then the people who use it as just this, a tool in the toolkit, as you mentioned. So yeah, I love the notion of widening as it refers to the category of orange wines. One of my favorite collections of poetry is called The Widening Spell of the Leaves by a poet named Larry Levis. And to me, what we're talking about right now is the widening spell of the grapes, the widening spell of skin contact. So wherever you are, I hope that you are able to find a bottle or find a producer who can, cast that spell on you. Certainly, it's a category that I've only just begun to explore. I haven't had too many experiences with orange wine, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this interview, is to give myself a little bit more of an excuse to to further my own
Nice.
education and my own palate, right? Um, so I don't want to conclude here and jump into the lightning round before I let you speak a little bit more about your most recent project. Earlier on, you were speaking about wooden paddles and, more importantly, the human appendages at the bottoms of our legs. So using that as a prompt, what is your most recent project?
Nice link, yeah. So this is the latest book that I've published together with my good friend and collaborator Ryan Opas, and it's a similar idea to it's a book called Foot Trodden, Portugal and the wines that time forgot. And how this book happened was basically Ryan worked with me as the photographer on Amber Revolution. And while we were traveling together and doing all the research for Amber Revolution, we started talking about Portugal, which is Ryan's adopted home. He's originally from Minnesota. And we both felt that there were strong parallels. For me, orange wine, when I started first researching it and enjoying the wines, which is now more than 10 years ago, it was very much the underdog. It was something that was poo-pooed, not taken seriously, and people said all kinds of rubbish about it. And I felt that Portugal, unfortunately, is a little bit the same. It's a little bit of the underdog amongst this cluster of classic European wine countries. It doesn't get the credit that it deserves. People don't explore it as deeply as they might. And so we felt, maybe we can do a similar book to Amber Revolution, but tackling Portugal and what we have seen as a real renaissance of exciting wine, of artisanal and often natural wine, and orange wines as well, by the way, being made in Portugal. They have their own special word for the style, which is called curtimento. So that was the genesis of this second book, really. So it's different because it's about one country, but in a way, it's a similar concept. It's a travelogue. It's the personal histories of people that we think are interesting and communicate something about Portuguese culture. So again, it's a book that we hope will connect people with Portugal, get them excited about it, and persuade them to go out and hunt down a bottle and experiment and drink something tasty.
Sure. And I think that's another really valuable contribution because so much of the grape related focus in Portugal tends to fall on port and to unfortunately the mass market vinho verdes that get exported. And there's nothing wrong with a sub $10 bottle of vinho verde that you bring to a cookout, and it's sort of a throwaway acid bomb that makes lots of people moderately happy, but doesn't make anyone think twice. But obviously, it's another super old wine tradition, right?
It is, and that's the thing with Portugal. I mean, my God, there is history and culture and such an amazing plethora of unique grape varieties. Again, grape varieties you don't find anywhere else. Traditions like the foot treading, which is still far more common in Portugal than you might suppose. So to us, it's a treasure trove for the wine curious consumer, and it just makes no sense to us that people don't delve into it more than they currently do. And as you were saying about Vinved, it's a little bit like the US is pigeonholed as, oh, the US wine, American wine is hearty Burgundy. It's $2 Chuck, and that's it. Imagine that.
Sure. Yeah. Do you think that the foot treading is part of the secret sauce that creates the Portuguese success in football, and that they spend so much time foot treading that they end up developing massive quads and hamstrings?
It's a good point, actually. I'd never thought about that. Unfortunately, I think my girlfriend knows more about football than I do, so it's not one of my passions, so I can't say. But
Well, Simon, this has been a fantastic conversation. I think it puts us at the perfect spot because it's a perfect primer for orange wine, but it only leaves you hungering for the book, the travelogue, the romance of the protagonist that much more. So I hope that everyone listening will look to pick up Amber Revolution. Is there anywhere that you would like to send people first and foremost to purchase this in a place where it might benefit you most?
well, I would say that if you're in the States, if you're in North America, then if possible, don't buy it from the rainforest retailer. It would be much nicer if you sort out your independent bookshop, or you can also buy it direct from the distributor in the US, which is interlinkbooks.com. And I believe, I think Indie Books, I forget what that site's called. So there's enough places to buy it without giving your money to someone who just wants to catapult themselves into space. So
Sure. So we'll be sure to have the do good links over on the show notes page over at modernbarcart.com/podcast. But Simon, you ready to jump into the lightning round?
Let's do it.
All right. First question. Generally, this is a spirits and cocktail podcast. Do you ever find yourself drinking spirits and cocktails? And if you do, what is your favorite?
I absolutely do, and I have a couple of. We already mentioned the Negroni. I love a good Negroni made with a nice artisanal Amaro. I'm partial to a gin and tonic, and we have an amazing selection of craft gins here now. I have a dirty secret as well, and probably half the listeners are going to hate me for this, but I love a well-made espresso martini. Okay. And I make them myself. I make them at home as well.
Well, this is great. Let's get into it. What constitutes for Simon Woolf a well-made espresso martini?
It's all about the sweetness, and I would say 99% of the time when I have an espresso martini in a bar, it's too sweet. And I've experimented with it at home, and I'm really looking at 1/4 of a teaspoon of sugar syrup per cocktail, and that's it.
And what are the other ingredients that you're using? I think everyone's familiar with the espresso martini as the, kind of shaken brown, maybe a little bit of foam on the top with the little espresso being garnished. But what particular ingredients are you using besides the sugar syrup for your rendition?
So I have an espresso machine at home. I have a semi-automatic. So I make a quality espresso shot, and I do think a freshly made espresso shot is really what it has to be. I'm a bit traditional, so I do tend to use Kahlua, which I think was the original recipe, and then a nice neutral vodka, basically. And then, as I said, just a tiny speck of sugar syrup, and not whatever most recipes have and whatever most bartenders seem to use, because it's just far too sweet.
For sure. Well, it seems like the espresso martini is something that we may need to dedicate a full episode on.
Maybe there's a book in there.
Oh yeah, wouldn't that be a fun way for me to enter the literary ranks as the espresso martini guy? All right, next question in this lightning round. What's a seemingly small or idiosyncratic occurrence that always makes your day?
Oh, that wasn't in your list of questions,
wasn't it? Oh, I'm
sorry. It kind of links to the last answer, actually. I am a sucker for a perfectly made coffee, and I love to take a moment in my day and just sit with a really well pulled shot, and that's why I ended up buying my own machine, actually, because I just thought, this, and actually I come down in the morning and I look at this kind of gleaming chrome kind of thing, and it makes me happy. So, I don't have a car. I've never owned a car. So I have an espresso machine instead.
I love it. If you could have a glass of wine with anyone in the world, past or present, who would it be? Where would you go? What would you enjoy with that person? Just kind of paint us your imaginary picture.
Yeah, I thought about this, actually. It's a great question. And it would be my mom. And the reason it would be my mom is that she died far too early. She died in 2009. And she didn't get to experience my wine adventure. And she was a person who got me excited about wine from a very early age. She wasn't an expert. She wasn't a connoisseur, but she was well educated. And she just, in her own very humble, very unpretentious way, she just provided me with some cues and demonstrated to me that wine is something varied and beautiful and well worth taking the time. And then kind of gradually, as I got older, the tables were turned. Instead of her telling me about wine and saying, this is this wine and this is why it tastes like that, it was me bringing bottles home and saying, hey, Mom, I bought a bottle of this, or have you ever had this? But she never experienced that point. She died before I really got deep into it. I think she would have had so much fun seeing me write about it. And what I would have loved to have introduced her to is two things, actually. I would take her to somewhere beautiful in Italy. She was an outstanding cook, and she loved cooking Mediterranean food. That was her go-to. She did it exceptionally well, despite never having been to Italy, never having been to Spain, never having been to Greece. So I would take her preferably to a beautiful Mediterranean island. She was a rather quiet person, so it would have to be somewhere nice and peaceful. Uh, we'd we'd sit and I'd open a bottle of probably of an orange wine, certainly something natural and cloudy, which is something she never got to experience, and that's what we'd enjoy.
Beautiful. Yeah, there's something to be said, especially in the wine world, where there's such a weight of, I guess, what you might call snobbery. Right? Right. You mentioned the winerati earlier. There's such a great weight of that looming over the entire culture of wine, that it seems like when you find somebody who is that true wine Jedi, right? Somebody who's not a snob, but they are a Jedi. They can kind of point you in the right direction. It seems like for you, your mom was somebody who, kind of started you off with those first few cues and recommendations that eventually grew into, what resulted in the two wonderful books that you were able to share with us today. So what better way than to share that back with her? That's a really beautifully painted picture. And what was your favorite Mediterranean dish that your mother would make you when you were young?
She did amazing things with a dish which has been much massacred, which is ratatouille.
Ah,
I mean, she grew all her own vegetables in the garden, and that made a difference. She could also make an extraordinary pizza, which
yeah.
is really something.
And two dishes that happen to be extremely wine friendly. Um,
Exactly.
well, so the last question I have for you, Simon, and as somebody who's traveled as widely as you have and has sampled as many different varieties and learned about them as you have, I imagine that you'll have an answer. It's do you have any potentially controversial views in the wine world?
I think just that I think there is an awful lot of ball talked about things like wine and food matching or how you're supposed to age wine. There's an awful lot of yeah, kind of received wisdom about some of these little ceremonies, which I think mostly is just unhelpful rubbish. And all we need to do really is pull the cork and enjoy.
I love it. Pull the cork and enjoy. I couldn't think of a better way to wrap up this interview. Simon, thank you. I've learned a lot. I know that
Thank
it's
you.
just the tip of the iceberg for me, and I'm sure that it is also just the tip of the iceberg for our listeners. So, could you just give us a way to connect with you or with, to be able to follow the books and your wine adventures in the digital or social media space before we sign off here?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'd say Instagram is a place where you'll find me quite easily, Simon J. Wolf. I do occasionally pop up on Twitter. And my own website, themorningclaret.com, is a good place to see what I've been dipping into. And if you want to read a bit more, then there's always new stuff going up there.
Excellent. Well, as I mentioned, we'll have links to all of this and more over on the show notes page, modernbarcart.com/podcast. We have two books that you now have homework to go out, pick up, enjoy. We have Amber Revolution, which is what we were primarily speaking about today. And we have Foot Trodden. Is Foot Trodden officially on the market yet?
Oh yes, yes, it was published last November in the States.
Okay, great. So both of them are on shelves waiting for you. Simon, thank you so much for being a guest right here on the Modern Bar Cart podcast.
Thank you so much, Eric.